From tonight on, don't ever set foot in my kitchen again, Nora. This restaurant, the name, everything inside it belongs to me." For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed in the main dining room of Delta Sol. Wine glasses hung in midair. Servers froze mid-step with trays raised high. The string trio let the last note die without finishing it. Nora stood in front of Grant with empty hands, not even bothering to pick up the apron her mother had sewn for her years before. More than 120 guests waited for tears for a plea for some desperate scene. She gave them nothing. She only looked down at the white cloth on the marble counter and at a splash of paprika sauce, the same sauce she had made minutes earlier to thank her staff. Then she saw Vivian's arm looped through her husband's, and she understood that the humiliation had been rehearsed. How could a man throw out the woman who had created every flavor in that building and still call himself the owner? If this story has already made you angry, stay until the end because you're about to find out who really owned the soul of that restaurant. Grant raised a black folder like it was a court sentence and smiled for the cameras. He announced that the company was entering a new era, more international, more profitable, less dependent on personal sentimentality. He was looking at Nora, but he was talking to the reporters. Then he introduced Vivian Ashford, food influencer and image consultant, as the new creative director of Delta Sol. Vivian stepped forward in a champagne-colored gown, kissed Grant just beside his lips, and let a diamond bracelet catch the light. Nora recognized it instantly. 2 weeks earlier, her husband had sworn it belonged to a client who had left it behind in his car. In that instant, the betrayal took on weight and shine and shape. Nora didn't bother asking how long it had been going on. It was enough to watch Vivian rest her hand on that folder as if she too owned the documents that had just destroyed a marriage and a career. "Don't turn this into a spectacle," Nora said quietly, and her voice still reached the front row. Grant answered that she had brought this on herself by refusing to modernize the menu, refusing investors, refusing every financial decision he tried to make. Vivian added that a luxury restaurant couldn't survive on sentimental recipes or employees who'd grown too comfortable. Behind the kitchen glass, Marcus clenched his fists. Dana, the floor manager, lowered a bottle she'd been about to open. A few guests pretended to check their phones, but none of them looked away. Grant opened the folder and showed copies of the business filing, the liquor license, the lease. Everything was in the name of Whitfield Hospitality Group, the company he had formed without ever explaining its full reach to Nora. According to those papers, she wasn't a partner. She was an employee without a valid contract, a chef fired during her own celebration. Nora scanned the photocopied signatures and felt a cold that ran deeper than shame. She recognized her own handwriting on 2 of the pages, but she had no memory of ever signing away her rights. Grant had used her trust, her exhausted nights, and her habit of signing whatever he described as routine paperwork from the bank. For years she had cooked while he handled what she called the boring parts. She had believed that division was love. Now she understood it had been a strategy. Vivian ordered a guard to walk her to the coat room to collect her things. Nobody moved. The man who had eaten there every Christmas, invited personally by Nora, stared at the floor. Grant slammed the folder against the counter and demanded she obey. Nora took a step toward him. Everyone expected a slap. Instead, she slid off her wedding ring and set it on the wood. "You can keep the signature, the lease, and tonight," she said. "But don't confuse owning the walls with having built what lives inside them." Grant's face went red at the murmur that ran through the crowd. He reminded her that every recipe developed there legally belonged to the restaurant and threatened to sue if she ever reproduced them. Vivian smiled, sure this was the final blow. Nora bent down, but not for the apron. She picked up a fallen spoon, set it on a tray, and walked toward the door. As she crossed it, she heard Grant order the music to start again. The quartet obeyed with a cheerful, absurd little tune. The applause that followed was weak, born more from fear than celebration. Nobody in that room realized the door had just closed on the only person capable of keeping that restaurant alive. 6 years earlier, Delta Sol didn't exist yet. There had only been a narrow storefront in the Treme neighborhood, 12 mismatched tables, a borrowed kitchen, and an exhaust fan that rattled every time the burners lit. Nora was 23, and she had just lost her mother Celeste, the woman who taught her how to turn scarcity into dignity. With their combined savings and a small loan, Nora rented that space and wrote in chalk on a board by the door, "Taste of Home." Grant showed up 3 months later as a customer. He wore a suit too sharp for that neighborhood and spoke with the ease of a man who had never once had to choose between paying the light bill and buying fresh fish. He came back the next day and the next and eventually offered to build her a website for free. Nora believed he'd fallen for her effort. In time, she would learn he had also fallen for the potential everyone around her was starting to notice. Grant was charming back when he had nothing to claim credit for. He helped close up at night, carried boxes, told her that her talent deserved a bigger stage. When they married 2 years later, she already had a glowing review and a loyal following. He offered to handle suppliers' taxes and the bank so she could stay focused on the kitchen. "We're one team," he liked to say whenever he needed a signature. Nora agreed because she trusted her husband and because the business was growing faster than either of them could keep up with. The move to the city center came with expensive investors and a new name, Delta Soul. Grant insisted on simplifying the ownership structure to avoid tax problems. She never read the fine print. While he met with lawyers, Nora slept 4 hours a night, trained her staff, and refined a menu that blended Celeste's flavors with modern technique. Every award that came in carried the Whitfield name, even though every plate was born in Nora's hands. The first warning sign came when Grant started correcting her in front of the staff, criticizing her portions, growing furious whenever reporters only wanted to speak with the chef. Nora kept including him, kept thanking him publicly, kept insisting the restaurant belonged to both of them, but the more credit she shared, the more he seemed to need to take it away entirely. Vivian arrived during a social media campaign. She had hundreds of thousands of followers and a family tied to the luxury hotel business. She walked in with a photographer, turned down 3 tables before choosing the one with the best light and asked to meet the owner. When Nora came out of the kitchen, Vivian offered a polite smile and directed every single question to Grant. He enjoyed the attention. Within weeks, the marketing meetings had left the office entirely, moving to hotel lounges and private terraces where Nora was never invited. She didn't suspect an affair at first. She suspected something worse, that Grant had grown ashamed of the woman with rolled-up sleeves who smelled like smoke. He started excluding her from events, claiming he needed to protect her image as an untouchable artist. Vivian proposed replacing the traditional dishes with plates designed purely for photographs, raising prices and cutting veteran staff. Nora refused because she knew every single person on that team. Marcus had come to her with a resume stained by an unfair firing, and nobody else would hire him. She'd given him a chance. Dana worked double shifts to help care for her sick father, and Nora had rearranged her schedule to make it possible. The small farmers trusted her word because she never once paid them late. To Grant, those relationships were expenses. To Nora, they were the invisible framework holding the whole restaurant up. That difference eventually became a quiet war. 3 months before her expulsion, Grant unveiled an expansion backed by the Ashford family, new locations in other cities, a standardized menu, and frozen products sold under the Delta Soul name. Nora understood the quality would disappear, and she refused to sign off. Grant accused her of fearing success and left the house for 2 nights. When he came back, he seemed remorseful, cooked for, and promised never to decide anything without her again. That same week, Nora signed documents he described as insurance renewals and banking authorizations. Buried underneath the technical language were the transfer of the trademark and her resignation as company administrator. Vivian was already listed as an outside consultant. The trap had been built patiently. Grant didn't want to convince her of anything. He wanted to make her legally unnecessary. He was simply waiting for the perfect moment to expel her in front of witnesses and present himself as a brave businessman standing up to an unstable wife. That moment was the 6th anniversary. Grant knew there would be press and that Nora would never start a fight in front of her own staff. He also knew the dinner depended on her cooking, so he kept her in the kitchen until every plate was finished. Only then did he call her out to the dining room under the pretense of presenting an award. The plaque never existed. In its place were the black folder and Vivian's hand resting on her husband's arm. As Nora walked through the rain, she reconstructed every detail. The interrupted phone calls, the hidden invoices, the unfamiliar perfume in the car, the private meetings, the rushed signatures. She wasn't crying for the man who had betrayed her. She was crying for the 23-year-old who had believed that sharing her dream meant being protected. That young woman had handed over the keys to her own future, never imagining that someone would use her love to change the locks. Rain fell over the cobblestone street, turning Delta Sol's lights into gold reflections. Nora ducked under the awning of an empty storefront directly across the street. The window was covered in dust. Behind the glass sat stacked chairs, an old bar, and a crooked "For Lease" sign. She barely glanced at it. She wasn't thinking about starting over, only trying to breathe without feeling like her chest was splitting apart. From the other side of the street came the music of the anniversary party and the flash of cameras. Grant would be telling his version by now that the professional split had been amicable, that Nora simply needed rest, that Vivian would bring fresh energy to the brand. Every word would turn betrayal into strategy. Nora leaned her forehead against the cold glass. Her own reflection looked like a stranger, wet hair ruined, makeup, hands marked by old burns, and no keys in her pockets. The door of Delta Sol burst open. Marcus came out still in his chef's whites and crossed the street, ignoring the honking cars. He was carrying something folded in his arms. When he reached the awning, he was breathing hard with anger. Nora told him to go back before Grant fired him too. Marcus laid his white coat down at her feet, then set his chef's hat on top of it. He said Grant had ordered the kitchen to keep running like nothing happened, but nobody left knew how to finish the sauce or plate the main course correctly. Vivian had walked into the kitchen demanding smiles and threatening to fire anyone who said Nora's name. Marcus told her she could buy followers, but not years of skill. Then he walked off the line. "I'm not cooking for people who think a recipe is just a list of ingredients," he said. Nora felt fear, not relief. She reminded him he had a daughter, rent responsibilities, that couldn't depend on a lost cause. Marcus answered that it was precisely because of his daughter that he needed to prove loyalty wasn't for sale. He reminded her of the afternoon she hired him, back when he'd been unemployed for months, and everyone turned him away over a false theft accusation. She had investigated his former employer and gotten the complaint withdrawn. Since then, Marcus had promised himself he wouldn't forget who treated him like a person when everyone else saw a problem. While he spoke, the door opened again. Dana appeared with her coat on and a blue folder pressed to her chest. Behind her came two servers, a kitchen assistant and the pastry chef. They didn't cross the street yet. They stood beneath Delta Sol's awning, watching Nora, waiting for a sign. Grant appeared behind them, furious with Vivian a few steps away. He shouted that anyone who walked off that night would be blacklisted from every serious restaurant in the city. Some of them hesitated. Nora told them to go back, not to sacrifice their stability for her. Grant smiled, taking it as surrender. Then Dana crossed the street, alone, placed the blue folder in Nora's hands, and whispered that it contained copies of invoices, emails, and bank transfers that Grant had ordered her to destroy. She didn't know the whole truth yet, but she knew that for months, large sums had been transferred to a company connected to Vivian. She'd also found messages where Grant discussed removing Nora and asked for advice on shutting down any legal claim his wife might make. Nora clutched the folder. For the first time since the humiliation, the pain made room for something else, not revenge, but a firm need to understand exactly how much had been stolen from her. One by one, the employees began to cross. Not everyone left that night. Some needed their final paycheck. Others were simply afraid, but every step chipped away at Grant's confidence. Marcus stayed at Nora's side, Dana on the other. The pastry chef promised to finish the night service so the customers wouldn't suffer, but announced it would be his last shift. Two servers said the same from the doorway. Vivian scoffed and said there would be 100 candidates lined up by tomorrow. Nora looked at her without hatred. Vivian could hire hands. But she didn't understand that coordination is built from shared memory, a glance that catches an allergy in time, a gesture that saves a dish, a trust that prevents chaos. Grant saw interchangeable uniforms. Nora saw years of mistakes, lessons, and long nights. They had all carried together. That was the wealth no legal document could ever record. When the remaining staff went back to finish the service, Nora stayed under the awning with Marcus and Dana. The blue folder felt heavy in her arms. Dana pointed at the empty storefront and explained it had once been a family-owned diner, closed after a dispute among the heirs. The rent was steep, but the space had sat empty for almost a year. Nora shook her head. She had no money, no brand, no legal right to serve her own dishes without risking a lawsuit. Marcus looked at the window and said they didn't need to copy anything. They could cook a different way with the same respect. Nora answered that a kitchen wasn't built on speeches. It needed ovens, permit suppliers, months of work. Dana didn't argue. She simply pressed the for-lease flyer against the glass so the phone number was visible. In that small gesture was a possibility. Across the street, Grant raised a toast beneath the lamps Nora had chosen herself. In front of him in the darkness, something without a name was beginning to take shape. Nora studied the front of Delta Soul. She remembered the first night they'd turned on those lights, when Grant hugged her on the sidewalk and swore nobody would ever take her work away from her. She thought of her mother, of the small storefront in Tremé, of the chalkboard sign written by hand. Then she understood she had already started from nothing once before. What she lacked wasn't talent. It was the certainty that she still had the right to try again. She opened the blue folder and found a digitally signed transfer from Grant to Ashford Media. The amount was enough to cover several months of rent on the empty space across the street. It was money her own cooking had earned, pulled out without her consent, to fund the woman who had just taken her place. Nora looked up. She made no promise to win the restaurant back or to destroy Grant. She only said that at sunrise she would call the landlord. Marcus smiled. Dana saved the number. While the music kept playing across the street, the first crack appeared in the empire Grant believed he had conquered. At 7 the next morning, Nora called the number taped to the glass of the empty storefront. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Fontaine, sounded wary when she asked about the lease terms. He explained the space had been closed for 11 months, needed repairs, and nobody had ever agreed to pay the full deposit. Nora asked for an immediate walkthrough, even though she still had no idea how she'd come up with the money. Marcus and Dana showed up with coffee notebooks and a determination that made her uncomfortable, because it turned a desperate idea into a real commitment. The inside smelled like damp wood and old oil, cracked tile, rusted pipes, a kitchen so small that 3 people could barely fit inside it. Still, the morning light came in through the front window and fell right across the old bar. Across the street, Delta Soul sat, lit up, gleaming and closed like a jewel with no true owner. Fontaine recognized Nora and carefully avoided any mention of the scandal from the night before. He admitted his wife had once celebrated an anniversary there, and he still remembered the creamy shrimp and grits she'd personally cooked for them. That memory opened a door that money never could have. The landlord agreed to lower the deposit and give her 2 months of grace if she presented a serious renovation plan. Nora made no promises about success. She talked to him about hours of operation permit suppliers and the need to preserve parts of the old structure. Her honesty convinced him more than any pitch could have. When they stepped outside, Dana quietly calculated the costs and ended up writing down an impossible number. Marcus offered to sell his motorcycle. Nora refused. She wasn't going to let anyone wreck their life over a fight she wasn't even sure she could win. Dana told her they weren't sacrificing anything. They were choosing where they wanted to work and who they wanted to respect. While Nora measured walls, Grant and Vivian were holding an emergency meeting inside Delta Soul. The anniversary night had ended 40 minutes late with returned plates and 2 tables that left without dessert. Grant blamed Marcus the servers and what he called his wife's emotional manipulation. Vivian insisted they needed to replace the whole team before the press found out how bad things were. She posted a job listing, promising competitive pay and access to an exclusive environment. She got hundreds of responses, but most came from applicants with no real experience, drawn purely by her fame. Still, she insisted any cook could follow a written recipe. She had every dish printed out and slid into laminated folders. Grant looked at the pages with relief. There were names, ingredients, temperatures. He believed he finally had everything he needed. He didn't understand that those documents were incomplete maps of a territory only Nora knew how to navigate. The first trial run was a disaster. The pecan cream sauce turned bitter because nobody knew the exact moment to pull the toasted skins. The fish fell apart trying to flip it. The citrus reduction came out far too sweet. Vivian tasted each dish with open disgust, as if the problem were the new cook's clumsiness and not the missing knowledge behind every step. Grant called Marcus and offered to double his salary if he came back as head chef. Marcus listened without interrupting until Grant threatened to make sure he never worked in the city again. Then Marcus told him a kitchen built on threats only ever serves food made out of fear. He hung up and went back to scraping grease off a countertop across the street. Nora overheard part of the call and felt a wave of guilt. Marcus told her not to mistake it for obedience. He hadn't left to protect her. He'd left because he'd spent years watching Grant look down on work he never understood. Now, for the first time, he could choose not to be part of it. Over the following 3 days, the street turned into a silent battlefield. On one side, trucks unloaded new furniture, gold lamps, and a sign bearing Vivian's name right beside Delta Soul's. On the other, the former staff hauled out debris, scrubbed grease off the walls, and repaired tables pulled from a storage unit. Grant ordered the facade redesigned to look more exclusive. He had the old mosaic Nora's mother once commissioned covered over and replaced the phrase "We cook the way we remember" with "luxury you can taste." Nora watched the workers pry off the old letters without protest. She only took a photograph of the mosaic before it disappeared. She wasn't trying to save the wall. She wanted to remember the distance between what they had built together and what Grant now wanted to sell. That afternoon, she wrote a single word on a sheet of paper. Roots. Nobody asked why. Everyone understood the new restaurant needed a name that couldn't be stolen with a signature. Grant's problems grew worse when the suppliers started calling. Wade Hensley was the first to show up. He walked into the office with 3 unpaid invoices and demanded a firm date. Grant pretended to be surprised, blamed Nora for mismanaging the books, and asked for a week. Wade knew it was a lie. For years, Nora had checked every delivery herself and paid within 48 hours personally, calling him whenever a harvest didn't meet the promised quality. Grant, meanwhile, had spent months delaying payments while quietly funding Vivian's campaigns. Wade cut off the vegetable oil and seasonal produce supply. Grant threatened to sue him for breach of contract, but the agreement clearly allowed suppliers to halt deliveries on overdue debt. Before leaving, Wade glanced across the street. He saw Nora covered in dust hauling a box alongside Marcus. He didn't cross right away. He needed to see for himself whether she was building something real or simply running from her own humiliation. That same night, Wade walked into the empty storefront carrying a basket of tomatoes, fresh herbs, and warm bread. He said he wasn't there for charity. He wanted to know what Nora planned to cook and how she intended to pay for it. She laid her numbers out on the bar and explained she'd open with a small menu, 4 starters, 3 mains, 2 desserts, built around whatever was in season. She couldn't pay full price the first month, but she offered a transparent payment schedule in writing. Wade reviewed the numbers, asked about margins, and discovered she had even calculated her expected weekly waste. He didn't see desperation, he saw discipline. He agreed to supply her on 45-day credit on one condition: that Roots list the origin of every ingredient on the menu and continue supporting small farmers even after it succeeded. Nora shook his hand. Grant had treated suppliers like replaceable parts. She treated them as part of the dish itself. That difference began to tip the scale. Inside Delta Soul, Vivian decided to erase every dish associated with Nora and build a more photogenic menu. She hired a culinary consultant who designed dramatic plates for social media, but who had never once run a full dinner service. Prices rose 30% and portions shrank. On opening night of the new era, guests photographed everything enthusiastically, though many left their meals nearly untouched. A couple celebrating their 5th anniversary there asked about Nora. Vivian told them the former chef had suffered an emotional breakdown and needed time away. Dana, still picking up a few shifts to collect her final pay, overheard the lie and felt sick. She started keeping notes, names of customers who'd asked questions, screenshots of messages, where Vivian instructed staff to repeat the story about instability. She realized leaving wasn't enough. If they wanted to protect Nora, they needed proof of every lie before Grant could rewrite the whole story. 2 days later, Dana handed in her formal resignation in front of the entire staff. Vivian accused her of disloyalty and reminded her that nobody was irreplaceable. Dana answered that the real disloyalty was using 6 years of someone else's work to manufacture a lie. She left her keys on the counter and walked out. 3 servers followed her. The pastry chef left after that, then the reservations manager, then 2 kitchen assistants. There were no speeches, only the sound of keys hitting the counter, one after another. Gail watched the line with a mix of rage and fear. He'd prepared Nora's expulsion certain everyone else would stay put for the sake of their paychecks. He never imagined that legal authority couldn't buy moral obedience. Vivian applauded slowly and swore she'd replace them all before dinner service. Yet when the doors opened that night, Delta Soul had 30 reservations, 6 brand new employees, and nobody capable of running the floor without turning every single order into an argument. Nora welcomed the ones who'd resigned with real concern. She explained that Roots still had no license, no money, no opening date, and that some of them might go weeks without a paycheck. Dana suggested arranging temporary shifts elsewhere until the restaurant could actually function. The pastry chef offered his home oven for early recipe testing. The servers offered to paint sand and repair furniture. Nora tried to slow down that wave of generosity, but Marcus pulled her to the center of the room and asked her to look around. Nobody was there out of pity. Every single one of them had been protected by her at some point. An adjusted schedule, an interest-free loan, a defense against a rude customer, a second chance after a mistake. Grant believed paying a salary bought loyalty. Nora had built something far harder to measure. She took a breath and accepted one condition. Every contribution would be recorded as future equity or company debt. She wouldn't let her team's sacrifice disappear under a single name. Word of the mass exodus reached the food press. Grant responded with a statement accusing Nora of sabotage poaching staff and unfair competition. A lawyer sent warning letters to the former employees and suppliers, threatening legal action if they shared any internal information. The letter reached Wade, too, and several other suppliers. Some got scared, but most already knew about the unpaid debts and chose not to renew their contracts. Within a week, Delta Soul lost access to its artisanal oil, its trusted seafood supplier, and the small farms that had stocked its kitchen from the beginning. Vivian suggested buying from industrial distributors and rewriting the menu descriptions to hide the change. Grant agreed. The restaurant kept posting the same old photos on social media, even though the food itself no longer resembled them. The walls still gleamed, the name still hung over the door, and reservations still trickled in out of habit. But every night something was missing that no customer could quite name until they tasted the first bite. At Roots, the first test runs began on 2 borrowed burners. Nora refused to recreate Delta Soul's dishes exactly. She didn't want to live under the shadow of a lawsuit or turn her new restaurant into a nostalgic copy. She took the techniques her mother had taught her and pushed them toward entirely different flavors. She made a smoked butterbean puree finished with citrus oil, a catfish dish cooked over charred corn husks, and a wild mushroom and pecan stew with toasted bread. Marcus suggested small adjustments. The pastry chef created a honey and thyme pudding, and each member of the team tasted the results, sitting on overturned wooden crates. For the first time, decisions weren't coming down from an office. Nora listened, corrected, and shared credit. Dana noticed the menu was coming together like a conversation. That night, they set the finished plates on the old bar. No fancy dishware, no photographers, but the smell filled the room, and people on the sidewalk stopped to peer through the glass. Grant watched too. From his office window, he saw his former staff laughing around Nora and felt like something was being taken from him that he'd never truly owned in the first place. He called the landlord and tried to offer more money to kill the lease. Fontaine turned him down flat, then told Nora about the call. She wasn't surprised. Grant had gone from celebrating his victory to fearing a door that hadn't even opened yet. That same night, he crossed the street for the first time. He walked in without a greeting, looked over the renovation, and announced that Roots would never open because every dish created during their marriage legally belonged to Delta Soul. Nora answered that a recipe could be registered, but experience, judgment, and memory didn't fit inside a folder. Grant offered her money to come back as an anonymous chef while Vivian kept the public spotlight. Nora looked at him with a calm that clearly unsettled him. She didn't want her old kitchen back. She wanted his silence. "You don't need your old position," he insisted. "You just need to cook and let us handle the rest." In that moment, Nora understood he wasn't sorry for betraying her, he was sorry he couldn't replace her. She asked if Vivian knew about this offer. Grant dodged the question and raised the amount. Marcus stepped closer, but Nora stopped him with a look. She wanted to hear exactly how far her husband's arrogance would go. Grant insisted Roots would fail, that the staff would come crawling back once they got hungry enough, and that the suppliers would always choose the wealthier client. Nora pointed to the unpainted walls, the repaired tables, and the crates stamped with farmers' names. She said she might fail, but she'd do it under her own name, without asking anyone's permission to exist. Then she opened the door and asked him to leave. Grant crossed the street under the gaze of both teams, and for the first time he looked small standing beneath the enormous sign that still carried his name. Customers began noticing Delta Soul's decline. Reviews mentioned long waits, cold plates, and flavors nobody recognized. Vivian responded from the official account, accusing critics of resisting change, a tone that turned scattered complaints into a full-blown public crisis. Food critic Alan Medina stopped by unannounced. He'd written the very first review that launched Nora's career and knew every detail of the original menu. He ordered 3 dishes and asked to speak with the chef. Vivian appeared instead, introduced herself as the architect of the restaurant's new era, and recited concepts she'd clearly memorized. When Alan asked about the origin of a sauce, she confused 2 essential ingredients. The next day, he published a devastating review. The restaurant still had the dishware, the marble, and the name, but it had lost the voice that gave any of it meaning. The line spread quickly online. Grant ordered it scrubbed from every social media account, as if a truth could simply be deleted. Nora read the review sitting on the floor of Roots, surrounded by invoices and tools. She felt no satisfaction. Every blow against Delta Soul still bruised a story she had once loved. Dana reminded her that the failure wasn't her fault. It belonged to the people who believed they could keep a legacy alive while erasing the woman who created it. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived from Grant's attorney. It formally accused her of trade secret theft, illegal poaching of staff, and reputational damage. It demanded she stop construction immediately, return any material tied to the original recipes, and pay damages far greater than everything she owned. The staff went quiet. Nora read every page and felt the same fear return from the night of the anniversary. If a judge sided with Grant, Roots could die before it ever opened. Dana set the hard drive she'd been holding on to down on the counter. She said they still didn't know exactly what was on it, but maybe it held the difference between an accusation and the truth. Nora didn't open it right away. She gathered the team and told them plainly nobody was obligated to stay. The lawsuit could complicate their lives, and they could still walk away without losing anything. Nobody moved. Wade laid the first supply contract on the counter. Marcus lit one of the burners. Dana picked up a paintbrush and kept working. That small collection of gestures answered more clearly than any promise ever could. Nora walked to the front window and pressed a printed sheet against the glass. In bold letters it read, "Coming soon, Roots." Underneath, in her own handwriting, she added, "Nobody here is replaceable." Across the street, Grant stepped out of Delta Sol, with Vivian at his side. Both of them saw the gathered team and the new name staring back at them. Vivian laughed. Grant didn't. He was beginning to understand that he still owned the building, the brand, and the paperwork, while Nora was quietly reclaiming everything that could never be registered on any document. The hard drive sat on the bar at Roots like a locked box nobody wanted to touch. Nora was afraid the evidence wouldn't be enough, or worse, that it would confirm just how far Grant had gone in exploiting her trust. Dana finally connected it to an old laptop and found folders labeled with supplier names, campaigns, contracts, and monthly financial statements. Many were password protected, but others contained automatic backups of the corporate email account. For hours, they read through messages where Grant instructed staff to present interviews with Nora as the operational talent and himself as the visionary founder. In one of the older exchanges, Vivian had recommended registering the trademark without telling Nora until the Ashford family investment closed. Grant's reply was short. "She'll sign. She always signs when I tell her it's urgent." Nora read the sentence 3 times. She wasn't shocked. She was ashamed of ever mistaking her own trust for a decision to stop protecting herself. Dana then found a folder titled Contingency Plan N.C. Inside were draft press statements, unsigned psychological evaluations, and a full strategy to present Nora as emotionally unstable if she ever tried to claim ownership. The plan included prepared testimony from former consultants, records of her excessive hours, and photographs taken during moments of pure exhaustion. Grant had planned to turn the very burnout his demands caused into proof that she was unfit. There were also invoices paid to Ashford Media for campaigns that never ran, and transfers to a company called Bronze Capital. Nora didn't recognize the name. Dana dug through public records and discovered the company belonged to a cousin of Vivian's. In under 8 months, Grant had diverted enough money to cover the entire renovation of Roots. That discovery changed the whole shape of the story. He hadn't simply expelled his wife to hand the restaurant to his mistress. He'd used the whole team's labor to fund the very operation designed to replace them. Nora's attorney, a woman named Layla Baez, reviewed everything and warned that the emails were valuable but not enough on their own. They needed to prove the recipes, the concept, and the customer base existed before Grant ever registered the trademark. Ownership of a company could live on a single document, but authorship of a culinary method required dates, testimony, and original material. Nora thought of the boxes still stored in her late mother's apartment, closed up since her death nearly 5 years earlier. She hadn't been back in all that time. Just the thought of opening those cabinets brought a painful pressure to her chest. Still, she knew Celeste had kept everything: receipts, photographs, notebooks, letters, napkins covered in handwritten notes. Marcus offered to go with her. Nora accepted because she understood the search wasn't only about the lawsuit. To protect her future, she'd have to go back to the place where her whole story began and finally look at the pain she'd kept sealed away. Her mother's apartment smelled of lavender soap and closed-up wood. On the table still sat a cracked ceramic bowl, the one Nora had used to knead bread as a little girl. Every room seemed to be waiting for an arrival that would never come. In the kitchen cabinet, they found 3 notebooks wrapped in blue fabric. The first pages belonged to Celeste budget-friendly recipes, substitutions for lean times, and notes written directly to her daughter. Further in, they found Nora's younger handwriting, dated years before she ever met Grant. There were sketches of plates, salt ratios, taped-in photographs, and notes about her very first customers back in Tremé. One page held the origin story of the creamy shrimp and grits that eventually made Delta Sol famous. Celeste had written in the margin, "A recipe isn't a formula, it's knowing who you're feeding." Nora rested her hand over those words and cried without holding back. Marcus stayed quiet, understanding they had just found something no business filing could ever fabricate. The boxes also held invoices from her first suppliers, permits from the Tremé location, and photographs of Nora cooking long before Grant entered her life. On a small memory card, they found videos Celeste had recorded herself. One showed Nora tasting a sauce in front of 6 neighbors, all playing along as makeshift customers. Another captured the opening of her very first location, complete with a hand-painted sign and a young Grant sitting in the crowd, still just a visitor. Layla confirmed the dates could prove the dishes and the concept existed long before Grant. Wade contributed his old delivery logs, each one signed by Nora with notes on ingredient quality. He still had photos from her earliest weeks in business, along with messages where she'd explained techniques to him directly. The pastry chef produced an old contract that formally recognized Nora as the creator of the menu. The defense wasn't built on one extraordinary document. It was built from hundreds of small traces Grant had never thought important because they came from people he'd always considered too small to matter. The most powerful piece of evidence turned up in a local news archive. Alan Medina remembered an interview filmed during Delta Soul's 2nd anniversary and requested the full, unedited footage rather than the short clip that had aired. In the video, the host asked Grant about the restaurant's success. Still proud back then to be married to a celebrated chef, he answered plainly, "Everything you eat here, Nora created. I just try to get the world to notice what she can do." He went on to say the recipes were born in a small storefront in Tremé, and that his wife had spent years developing them with her mother. Layla played the recording for the whole team at Roots. Nobody celebrated. That voice belonged to a version of Grant who had once needed to admit the truth in order to benefit from it. Nora realized the strongest witness against the man he'd become might be the man he'd once pretended to be, back when he still needed to earn her trust. Meanwhile, Delta Soul kept losing customers. The new cooks followed the recipe cards to the letter, but every service felt like an imitation, with no memory behind it. One recipe called for reducing a sauce until the texture felt right, but nobody knew how to recognize that exact moment. Another required balancing acidity based on how ripe the tomatoes were, a judgment call no printed number could replace. Vivian grew furious every time a dish failed to match the old photographs. She ordered food coloring foams and elaborate garnishes to disguise the differences, but the results only looked more artificial. Regular customers stopped booking tables. Some crossed the street just to ask when Roots would open. Grant watched those conversations from behind the window and had the glass covered with opaque film. He preferred not seeing curiosity turn into support. The press began calling it the War of Two Sidewalks, though Nora turned down every interview. She refused to turn her team into a spectacle, and she wouldn't hand Grant any material to twist into new accusations of sabotage. Vivian discovered the true scale of the financial damage by accident while searching for a corporate card to book a promotional trip. She found notices for 3 overdue loans. Grant had put up future restaurant revenue and part of an inherited apartment as collateral. The accounts were nearly empty. Suppliers were demanding payment, and the money the Ashford family had promised never arrived in full. Vivian had believed Grant controlled a solid, thriving company. In reality, he was surviving on advance bookings and credit. She confronted him in the office and demanded an explanation. Grant claimed the downturn was temporary and that everything would recover once Nora finally handed over her recipes. Vivian understood in that moment that he hadn't chosen her to replace his wife. He had used her to appear connected to capital and prestige he didn't actually have. And she, in turn, had chosen him because she thought he was wealthy. The relationship that had destroyed a marriage began cracking apart the moment neither of them found what they'd actually wanted in the other. Instead of walking away, Vivian doubled down, convincing Grant to file an emergency legal motion to block Roots from opening, pending a dispute over intellectual property. Layla received a filing claiming Nora had copied suppliers' staff techniques and even the strategic location of the new restaurant. The argument was flimsy, but it could still delay permits through sheer administrative confusion. Nora wanted to respond publicly with the interview footage and Celeste's notebooks. Layla advised against it. Revealing every piece of evidence too early would let Grant prepare a counter-defense and attack the authenticity of the documents. They needed to save it all for the proper proceeding. That waiting period was almost unbearable. Nora watched the coming soon sign every day while the bills piled up, knowing each closed day burned through money her own team had contributed. Still, she decided to follow the advice. She wasn't going to let urgency push her into the same mistakes she'd made before signing speaking or acting before she understood every consequence. Work at Roots continued anyway. Inspectors approved the electrical system and requested small changes to the ventilation and storage areas. Wade organized a network of farmers willing to accept deferred payment. Dana designed a simple, transparent reservation system with no reserved tables for celebrities. Marcus set up the kitchen so every station had a voice during service. Nora kept testing the menu, cutting anything that felt too close to Delta's soul. She wasn't rejecting her own identity, but she refused to spend her life defending herself against accusations of stealing her own work. She created a new dish, charred okra in a smoked corn broth with aged cheese, a plate that existed in none of her old notebooks. When the team tasted it, the silence was followed by smiles. Nora realized that creation was proof no lawsuit could ever file away. They could lay claim to old recipes, but nothing could stop her talent from producing something entirely new. Grant requested a private meeting through the lawyers. Nora went with Layla and found her husband in a quiet hotel room far from Vivian's eyes. He presented a formal offer. He would drop the lawsuit if Nora agreed to work 6 months as a confidential culinary advisor, hand over her notebooks, and authorize permanent use of the original dishes. Her name would never appear in any campaign or public document. In exchange, she'd receive a significant payout, and Grant would publicly describe their professional split as amicable. It was an elegant version of the same humiliation cooking in the shadows, so his new partner could keep the spotlight. Nora asked why he needed her services at all if he'd been so certain he could replace her. Grant said the market was unfair, that customers clung to sentimental images. He never once admitted the actual food was the problem. Nora reached into her bag, pulled out a copy of the old interview, and set it on the table without playing it. She told him there was proof he'd known the true authorship of every recipe and that he had spent months preparing her removal. Grant lost his composure. He accused her of destroying both their legacies out of pride and claimed Celeste would have wanted her to negotiate instead of risking everything. The mention of her mother changed the entire air in the room. Nora stood and warned him never to use Celeste's name to justify a betrayal again. He reached for her arm, but Layla stepped between them. Before leaving, Nora rejected the offer and left him with one last line he had no answer for. "You don't want my recipes because you love them. You want them because without me, you finally realized you never understood what you were actually selling." The meeting ended without an agreement. That same afternoon, Vivian received a leaked copy of the proposal and understood exactly what it meant that Grant was willing to hide his own wife behind her image if it helped him. The fight between Grant and Vivian happened right in the kitchen. She threw the documents on a table and asked if her only role had ever been to decorate a lie. Grant claimed the offer was just a temporary strategy, but Vivian saw the contempt underneath his words clearly for the first time. He needed her name to attract investors, and he needed Nora's hands to save the restaurant. The only thing he contributed on his own was control. Vivian threatened to pull her endorsement and talk to her family. Grant reminded her of the invoices paid to her own company and the transfers that could easily implicate her in fraud. They were both trapped. She knew his crimes, but she'd also profited from them. From that point forward, their alliance stopped being romantic and became a pact built on fear. Nora had no idea their relationship was collapsing, though Dana noticed a sudden spike of hostile emails passing between the two companies, the first sign that the people responsible were beginning to turn on each other. The night before opening, Roots finally looked ready. The restored tables gleamed under simple hanging lamps. The old bar still bore its original scars, and the smell of fresh bread filled the room. Fontaine placed a photograph of the original diner near the entrance. The staff rehearsed a full service, with friends and family standing in as customers. There were mistakes, but there was also a kind of coordination Delta Soul could no longer buy at any price. Nora gathered the whole team and announced that the first week was fully booked. Nobody cheered. Many cried quietly instead. Marcus raised a glass of water and toasted everyone who had chosen to cross the street when there was nothing but an empty storefront waiting on the other side. Nora thought of her mother and felt that Roots wasn't replacing the past, it was letting her grow again. For the first time since her expulsion, she let herself picture the open door. Customers walking in, dishes going out, all under a name that belonged to no marriage and no man, only to everyone who had helped build it. At 9 the next morning, 2 city inspectors arrived with a police officer. Dana assumed it was the final walkthrough, but the official handed over a notice of preventive suspension. An anonymous complaint claimed Roots was storing food without proper sanitary control, using ingredients of unknown origin, and had tampered with the emergency exit. The accusations were oddly specific, describing areas only staff suppliers and technicians had ever accessed. The inspectors found everything in order except for one box placed near the pantry the night before. Inside were unlabeled containers and spoiled meat that nobody on staff recognized. Wade confirmed it hadn't come from him. Marcus remembered a back window that had been found open at dawn. Nora understood immediately someone had broken in specifically to manufacture a violation. Still, the law required them to halt the opening. The Roots sign now faced a door that couldn't legally open. The staff watched from inside as the first customers arrived and read the suspension notice for themselves. Across the street, Vivian appeared in dark sunglasses wearing a carefully controlled smile. Grant stayed behind the glass pretending to check his phone. Nora didn't need a confession to know exactly where this had come from. Dana photographed the box and requested security footage from the neighboring businesses. Wade called his own attorney. Marcus wanted to storm across the street and confront Grant directly, but Nora stopped him. Responding with anger would only confirm the chaotic image their enemies wanted the world to see. Instead, she walked to the door, took down the opening sign, and wrote underneath the word, "Roots closed today, not defeated." The customers on the sidewalk started applauding. Grant looked away. He'd managed to stall the opening for one day, but he'd also just shown everyone exactly how afraid he was of watching it succeed. Nora spent the morning going through the complaint with Layla, Dana, and Wade. The filing had come from an unnamed consumer advocacy group, but the return address matched an office used by Ashford Media. Dana also uncovered an invoice from a crisis management firm Vivian had hired with a line item simply labeled "Local Competitor Oversight." Layla requested access records from the alley behind the building and obtained footage from a nearby pharmacy's security camera. It showed a man climbing through Root's back window before dawn carrying a box identical to the one the inspectors had found. His face wasn't clear, but the vehicle that dropped him off belonged to an agency contracted directly by Vivian. Nora understood the suspension hadn't been some impulsive act. It was a carefully planned operation designed to destroy trust before the first plate ever left the kitchen. Layla recommended they not publicly name Grant or Vivian until they had direct proof. Speaking too early would let the couple frame the accusation as a desperate move by a business owner already under investigation. Nora agreed even though the silence was painful. The team scrubbed every surface replaced, food that was still perfectly fine, and documented everything with photos and video. Wade produced traceability certificates for every single delivery. Marcus checked every lock window and camera. Dana called each reserved customer individually, explained the situation without exaggeration, and offered full refunds. Most declined the refund and asked to keep their table for whenever the restaurant finally opened. Some even brought tools, paint, and approved storage containers. The suspension meant to plant doubt began having the opposite effect. The neighborhood watched Roots defend itself with total transparency, while Delta Soul stayed hidden behind tinted glass. 2 days later, the inspectors returned with an independent technician. They checked the refrigeration units, storage ventilation exits, and sanitary logs. They found no irregularities anywhere. The contaminated box was removed as evidence, and the case was referred for possible intentional tampering. Roots got its authorization to open back, but the delay had eaten through nearly all the money set aside for payroll. Nora gathered the team and explained she could push the opening back another week or start with minimal resources right away. Nobody wanted to wait. The pastry chef offered to trim the dessert menu. Wade agreed to smaller delivery amounts. Dana rearranged the reservation schedule to avoid waste. Fontaine forgave part of that month's rent. Neighbors lent flower pots, lamps, and tablecloths. Watching that collective effort, Nora understood her real advantage was never a secret recipe. It was a network of people who felt genuinely respected. Grant could buy advertising all day long. She had built trust without ever realizing it would become her most valuable asset. The new opening date landed on the exact same night as Delta Soul's official relaunch. Vivian announced a gala, complete with press, live music celebrity guests, and a menu she called Rebirth. She'd deliberately chosen that date to prove Roots was nothing but a small imitation next to the supposed power of the original brand. The street filled with lights, photographers, and black town cars. Facing Delta Soul's red carpet, Roots set up a simple chalkboard listing the names of every farmer, fisherman, and artisan who'd contributed to the menu. Nora wore a plain white chef's coat, her hair pulled back exactly the way it had been in her earliest years. Marcus checked tickets. Dana greeted guests at the door, and Wade delivered the final crates of produce. There were no hired celebrities, only neighborhood families, former regulars, and curious journalists. Both doors opened almost at the exact same moment. For an instant, the street seemed split in two, one side built to be photographed, the other built to feed people. Roots' first service opened with small mistakes, a broken glass, a mixed-up table. A slow start on the appetizers. Nora never raised her voice. She moved from station to station, corrected quietly, without embarrassing anyone, and reminded the team that a kitchen isn't measured by the absence of mistakes, but by how everyone responds together. The plates began flowing with a steady rhythm. Guests could see straight into part of the kitchen and watched cooks, servers, and suppliers all calling each other by name. Alan Medina tried the charred okra dish and asked to speak with Nora, but she told him it would have to wait until after service. She wasn't going to leave the stove to feed anyone's personal narrative. That decision impressed him more than any interview ever could have. Across the street, Vivian posed at every table, interrupted servers mid-task, and demanded replated dishes whenever presentation didn't match her promotional photos. Grant smiled for the cameras but kept glancing across at Roots, where every table kept filling right back up. Midway through the night, a man in a gray suit walked into Roots and asked for a table without a reservation. Dana recognized his face from the pharmacy footage immediately, but showed no reaction. She seated him near the kitchen and quietly warned Layla he was in the room. He ordered the fish dish, took 2 bites, and started shouting that it smelled rotten. He knocked over his glass, accused Nora of serving dangerous food, and pulled out his phone to live-stream the whole scene. Several diners stood up. Marcus reached to pull the plate away, but Nora told him to leave it exactly where it was. Wade checked the delivery batch and produced the certificate on the spot. The man faked a gag and threatened to call the health department himself. That's when Dana set a small recorder on the table and pressed play. The man's own voice came through, accepting payment to stage a visible incident during Roots' opening night. The whole room went silent as the recording continued. A second voice, belonging to one of Vivian's assistants, could be heard telling him exactly which dish to attack and how to bring up the earlier false sanitary complaint. The man lunged for the recorder, but Layla blocked him, and 2 customers were already filming on their phones. Dana calmly explained she'd seen him meet with the assistant at a nearby coffee shop that same afternoon, sat at the table beside them, and recorded the whole conversation after recognizing the vehicle tied to the contaminated box. The man bolted for the exit, but an officer alerted by Layla stopped him right there on the sidewalk. In full view of the gala's cameras, he pointed at Delta Soul's front doors and shouted that he'd only been following instructions. Vivian's smile disappeared. Grant ordered security to shut the entrance, but it was already too late. Reporters crossed the street, asking about the recording, the false complaint, and the payments traced back to Ashford Media. Nora refused to let her dining room turn into a press conference. She asked the reporters to respect her actual guests, handed the recording over to police, and went straight back to the kitchen. Her calm shifted the entire mood of the night, even as Vivian screamed across the street that it was all a setup. Nora kept cooking. Diners who'd considered leaving sat back down. Some applauded when the next dish came out. Dana reorganized the floor, Marcus managed the timing, and the whole team turned an attempted sabotage into a demonstration of pure discipline. Alan wrote right from his table that Roots hadn't answered sabotage with spectacle, but with professionalism. The post spread fast. Grant watched his own guests' phones lighting up with the video of the man he'd hired. He tried to convince them it was just a disgruntled former employee paid off by Nora, but by then, documents already tied the car, the agency, and the payments directly to Vivian's company. The night, designed to crush Roots, had instead started exposing every crack in Delta Soul. Inside Delta Soul, the situation kept unraveling, as the kitchen lost control entirely. The industrial supplier had sent cheaper seafood and pre-made mixes without full allergen disclosures. Vivian had already ordered the allergy warnings stripped from the menus, saying they took up too much space and ruined the minimalist design. When a new server was asked about nut allergies, he answered from an outdated card. Minutes later, a guest began struggling to breathe. Her face swelled and she collapsed beside her table. The room filled with screaming. Nobody could find the first aid kit, and the floor manager had no idea who on staff had any medical training. A doctor dining nearby used the woman's own emergency injector and called for an ambulance. Grant tried to calm the cameras, but the woman's family demanded to know exactly what was in the dish. The kitchen couldn't answer because the original ingredient labels had been removed before service even began. The ambulance arrived while reporters were still covering the earlier scandal. Vivian wanted the curtains closed, but several guests were already live streaming the entire scene. Grant immediately blamed Wade, claiming the former suppliers had sent defective products out of pure revenge. Wade crossed the street with Layla and produced documents proving his supply had been suspended weeks earlier over unpaid invoices. He also showed recent invoices from the industrial distributor Grant himself had chosen. That distributor's representative, present at the gala, admitted they'd actually sent complete allergen information along with the shipment. Dana found an email on the hard drive where Vivian had ordered the allergen cards simplified for the servers. Her own assistant had warned her of the risk in writing. Vivian denied ever reading the message. Grant realized blaming Wade wasn't going to hold, so he turned on the new head chef hired only 3 days earlier. The man answered in front of everyone that he'd received direct instructions to cut costs and never reject a shipment no matter what. The guest stabilized before being taken to the hospital, but the gala was finished. Guests abandoned their tables, photographers blocked the entrance, and servers argued over who was supposed to hand over the sanitary records. Vivian dragged Grant into the office and demanded he take responsibility. He accused her of orchestrating the sabotage without covering herself. Vivian shot back that every decision had been made to save a company he'd already drained through his own loans and diversions. The argument carried straight down the hallway. Grant called her an opportunist and said she'd only gotten close to him for the money. Vivian laughed bitterly and told him he'd only gotten close to her for the Ashford name, the exact same way he'd married Nora for her talent. That sentence carried straight through the open door and onto several phones still recording. The relationship they'd presented as a new romantic and professional chapter was exposed for exactly what it was, an alliance between two people who only ever valued each other for what they could take. When Grant tried grabbing a reporter's phone, Vivian walked out of the office and decided to protect herself by striking first. She announced he had ordered cheap ingredients, hidden debts, and moved money through Bronze Capital. She claimed she never fully understood the scale of the fraud and had only followed her boss's instructions. Grant answered by showing messages where she'd personally proposed removing Nora manufacturing a reputational crisis and delaying the opening of Roots. Vivian slapped him in front of everyone. He grabbed her wrist and security had to physically pull them apart. That scene did more damage than any accusation Nora could have made because it came from two people who had built the whole plan together. Each one was exposing the other's guilt to try and save themselves. Layla, watching from the sidewalk, asked Dana to save every video she could get her hands on. Nora watched for a few seconds through the glass and felt no triumph at all. She saw two people tearing each other apart on the ruins of something that had taken years to build, and understood that ambition without loyalty always ends up hunting a new enemy. Financial investigators arrived just before midnight, along with health officials and a court-appointed representative. They weren't only there for the allergy incident. Layla had handed over the emails, transfers, and hard drive documents that same afternoon, and the recording of the hired provocateur accelerated everything. Agents requested computers, contracts, and full accounting records. Grant tried to block access, citing trade secrets, but the official presented a valid search warrant. Vivian asked for her own lawyer and physically stepped away from him. The remaining Delta Sol staff watched filing cabinets get carried out and hard drives copied on the spot. Some employees voluntarily handed over messages where Grant had ordered invoices altered. Others admitted they'd been instructed to use Nora's digital signature on documents she'd never even seen. The wall of silence started breaking down because nobody wanted to take the fall for crimes they'd committed to protect a man who had always considered them replaceable. The same fear Grant had used to control everyone now pushed them all to talk. At Roots, the final dish of the night went out while investigators moved in and out of the restaurant across the street. Nora asked her team not to get distracted. Every customer deserved to finish their meal without becoming a spectator to someone else's downfall. When the kitchen finally closed, the staff gathered in the dining room, exhausted, stained with sauce, still shaken from the sabotage. But they had served every single table. Dana announced that not one reservation had been canceled after the incident. Wade calculated that food waste had been lower than expected. Marcus placed the exact dish the provocateur had tried to discredit on the bar, still untouched, kept safely as evidence. Nora thanked her team and reminded them they hadn't beaten Grant that night. They'd proven they could stand on their own without becoming anything like him. That difference mattered more than anything. If they had built Roots only for revenge, they'd spend the rest of their lives living across the street from Delta Sol, even long after the building stopped existing. They needed to remember why they had opened in the first place, to cook with dignity and share the responsibility for everything together. Grant left the office, escorted by officers, though not yet under arrest. His records had been seized, and he was barred from destroying or altering anything. His jacket hung open, his face pale, every trace of the confidence he'd worn while throwing Nora's apron on the floor completely gone. He stopped on the sidewalk when he saw her locking up Roots with her team. For a few seconds, neither of them said a word. Vivian came out after him, with her lawyer refusing to even look his way. Cameras surrounded them both. Grant crossed the street and asked Nora for one private conversation. Layla tried to stop it, but Nora agreed to listen from the doorway. He claimed everything had spiraled out of his control, that Vivian was the one responsible for the sabotage, and that they could still save the restaurant if Nora would just declare the transfers had been authorized. He never once apologized for expelling her, forging documents, or destroying her reputation. He only wanted another signature to protect himself. Nora understood then that some people never regret the damage they cause, only losing control over its consequences. "I'm not going to lie to save you from the truth you built," she answered. Grant insisted Delta Sol was still part of his life too, and that letting it fall meant letting Celeste's legacy die with it. She looked at the facade, still lit up from the gala, surrounded by ambulances and inspection tape. She told him her mother's legacy had never lived in that marble or in a registered business name. It lived in the way you feed people without ever humiliating the ones working around you. Grant tried reminding her of their happy years together, but Nora no longer knew how many of those had been real, and how many had simply been part of preparing her to be controlled. She asked him never to use their past love as leverage again. Then she closed the door of Roots. Grant stood alone among the cameras and the building that still legally belonged to him, but that he could no longer actually run. For the first time, he understood that owning something never guaranteed keeping authority over it. The next morning, the street was littered with gala debris, gold ribbon, broken glass, programs printed with the word rebirth. Delta Sol remained closed under sanitary and financial investigation. Roots, meanwhile, opened for a simple breakfast service for the neighbors and workers nearby. Nora made coffee toast and a tomato soup out of whatever was left from the night before. She didn't raise prices or try to cash in on the media attention. Reporters waited outside for a statement. She handed them a short note instead. She would cooperate fully with the authorities and had no further comment on an open investigation. Allen published a piece arguing the real story wasn't Grant's spectacular collapse, but the way an entire team had chosen to rebuild without repeating the old owner's abuses. That line reached thousands of readers. Nora read it once and put her phone away. In front of her, the first tables at Roots were filling back up, while across the street, workers took down the gala signage. After breakfast, Layla arrived with new information. Investigators had found digitally signed contracts bearing Nora's name traced to an address linked directly to Grant's personal computer. They'd also found transfers to Braun's Capital Payments to the agency that had hired the provocateur, and messages tied to the false sanitary complaint. The case was no longer just about unfair competition. It now potentially included document forgery, fraudulent management coercion, and obstruction of a legitimate business. Vivian requested to testify separately, willing to trade information for a reduced sentence. Dana warned that didn't guarantee the truth would come out clean. Vivian could still lie, shift blame, and paint herself as a victim. Layla agreed. The most important part of the case still remained, proving in court that Grant had never legitimately held the rights he'd used to expel Nora in the first place. The public collapse was only noise. The real ending would depend on documents, testimony, and decisions made far away from any camera. Nora stepped outside and looked at both restaurants. Roots smelled like fresh bread. Delta Soul sat dark, with officials sorting through boxes behind the glass. She remembered the night of her expulsion, when she'd believed the man across the street had won simply because he still held the keys. Now she understood Grant had only inherited an empty shell he never knew how to hold up. Still, she wouldn't let herself believe the fight was over. Debts could still drag innocent workers down with them. The investigation would take time, and Grant's lawyers would try to turn every piece of evidence into doubt. Nora walked back inside where Marcus was training a new assistant, and Dana was reviewing the week's reservations with the servers. That single image steadied her. Her future no longer depended on reclaiming the past or on watching the people who betrayed her get punished. It depended entirely on protecting what they'd all built together. While the old restaurant was cataloged piece by piece, Roots began its second day, fully booked. The investigation stretched on for 6 weeks, while Roots learned to live under constant public attention. Every morning brought curious reporters and old Delta Soul regulars, but Nora held to one rule. Nobody interrupted service to ask for a statement. Layla built the case at a corner table after closing each night, surrounded by notebooks, invoices, and copied emails. The centerpiece was the trademark transfer Grant had used to expel his wife in the first place. A digital forensics expert confirmed the signature had been inserted from Grant's personal computer on a night when Nora had actually been cooking at a charity event across town. Security footage that Dana had saved proved she'd never touched a single piece of administrative equipment. The document that had turned her into a stranger in her own kitchen wasn't a mistake, a confusing clause, or a rushed decision. It was a forgery, planned with full awareness of exactly what it would do. Vivian testified 3 separate times. In the first interview, she presented herself as a consultant who'd been deceived by Grant. In the second, once she learned the messages existed, she admitted to taking part in the campaign to discredit Nora, though she claimed she'd never imagined it would include a false sanitary complaint. In the third, she handed over audio of Grant talking about stripping the brand of any sentimentality and promising to reclaim the recipes through financial pressure alone. Her cooperation didn't make her innocent. Layla found direct orders to hire the provocateur payments to the agency that planted the contaminated box and messages where Vivian openly celebrated the suspension of Roots. Prosecutors offered her a limited reduction in exchange for her testimony, but still pursued charges for sabotage, coercion, and document forgery. Once the media published the first details the brands sponsoring her dropped their contracts, her followers dwindled, and her own family stopped funding her business. Vivian discovered that the visibility she'd once wielded as power could just as easily become a room with no walls, where everyone watched her fall apart in real time. Grant chose to deny every accusation. He claimed the documents were signed with verbal consent, that the transfers were investments, that the emails had been taken out of context. His lawyer tried blaming Dana for copying private files and Marcus for organizing a coordinated walkout. He even claimed Nora had manipulated the suppliers just to sabotage Delta Sol from the outside. But every lie ran straight into a witness. Employees described meetings where Grant ordered debts hidden. Suppliers produced their non-payment notices. The culinary consultant admitted he'd been instructed to credit Vivian with dishes Nora had actually created. Even the guard who'd refused to physically remove her the night of the anniversary testified that Grant had asked him to stage the whole scene for the cameras. The story of the visionary businessman came apart under the weight of people he'd always considered too small to be believed. The authority he'd exercised for years had, in truth, only ever depended on everyone else staying silent. The main hearing took place at a commercial court downtown. Nora arrived without her chef's coat, dressed simply, flanked by Layla, Dana, and Marcus. Grant entered through a separate door, surrounded by attorneys. For a few seconds he looked at her as if searching for the woman who used to sign anything without asking a single question. She held his gaze without any hatred at all. Layla presented Celeste's notebooks, the videos from the Tremay location, Wade's delivery logs, and the interview where Grant had publicly acknowledged that Nora created everything. Opposing counsel suggested the materials could have been altered, but forensic experts confirmed the dates, the metadata, and the full chain of custody. Then they played the video. The voice of a much younger Grant filled the courtroom. "Everything you eat here Nora created." The man sitting before the judge lowered his head. He couldn't claim ignorance because his own past self was now testifying against him. When it was Nora's turn, Grant's lawyer tried to twist her trust into simple negligence. He asked why she'd signed documents without reading them, why she'd let her husband run the company alone, why she'd never insisted on being listed as an owner from the very beginning. Nora took a breath before answering. She admitted she'd been wrong to believe marriage could replace legal protection, but she flatly denied that mistake gave anyone the right to forge her consent. She explained she'd worked up to 16-hour days, that Grant had always presented paperwork as routine formalities, and that their division of labor had been built on a promise of equality. "Trust isn't giving up your right to exist," she said. That line wasn't for the cameras. It was for the woman she used to be. In the courtroom, several former employees lowered their eyes. Many of them understood the mechanism perfectly. No open threat is ever needed when someone can make surrendering everything feel like proof of love. Dana testified next, describing how Grant had created the contingency plan file, how he'd prepared reports meant to paint Nora as unstable, and how he'd ordered emails destroyed. Defense counsel accused her of holding a grudge over losing her job. Dana answered simply that she hadn't lost anything. She had resigned the moment she realized obeying meant becoming complicit. Marcus explained the staff hadn't been stolen away by Nora at all. Every single person made an independent choice after watching her humiliated and hearing Vivian declare that everyone was replaceable. Wade laid out the unpaid invoices and proved his business relationship with Nora had existed long before Grant ever registered the trademark. Fontaine testified about the attempted bribe meant to block the lease on Roots. A truth repeated from so many different angles became impossible to dismiss as personal revenge. The trial stopped being about a betrayed wife and became a clear portrait of a system of abuse built out of paperwork, fear, and contempt. The verdict came down 3 weeks later. The court declared the trademark transfer null and void, formally recognized Nora as the author of the original concept and menu, and ruled that Grant had used forged signatures to seize control of the company. He was also held responsible for fraudulent management, diversion of funds, and deliberate damage to a competing business. The criminal investigation would continue separately, but the civil ruling already barred him from using Nora's name, her story, or any recipe connected to her. Delta Sol was ordered to remove every photograph, promotional line, and mention of Celeste. The judge gave Nora the option to legally reclaim the trademark and take over the original space once the debts were settled. When Layla explained the options, everyone expected her to say yes. It was the victory the whole story seemed to be building toward, walking back and changing the locks, retaking the place she'd been thrown out of. Nora asked for one day to think it over, because she had learned that no important decision should ever be made in the noise of raw emotion. That night she crossed the street alone into Delta Sol, with judicial permission. The space stood closed, the lamps dark, the tables covered in cloth. The plaque from the 6th anniversary still leaned against the wall behind the counter. It had never carried her name, because the whole tribute had been a trap from the start. Nora walked to the kitchen, ran her hand across the old work table, opened the drawer where she used to keep her knives, and found a blue ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She could almost picture Celeste standing there, even though she knew her mother had never once seen this expensive space. She could also still hear Grant shouting, the apron hitting the floor, the music forced to keep playing after she'd been thrown out. She understood that reclaiming those walls wouldn't erase any of it. That building would always carry a history she no longer wanted to live inside. She didn't need to win by walking back in as the owner. She needed to prove that her future was never chained to the place where someone had tried to make her feel small. The next day, Nora told the court she was giving up her claim to the old brand entirely. She only demanded that Grant stop using her name, her recipes, and Celeste's image permanently. The people gathered at Roots were stunned. Marcus asked if it didn't hurt to walk away from something she'd built. She answered that she wasn't abandoning her work, only separating it from a shell that had become a symbol of deceit. The old restaurant could be sold off to cover creditors and unpaid wages. Any staff still working there would be compensated before a single investor saw a dime. When Grant learned of her decision, he asked to see her one last time. Nora agreed, with Layla present. He arrived without a suit, thinner, his face worn down. He said she'd won and that she could stop punishing him now. Nora answered that the ruling wasn't a punishment she'd designed, it was simply the consequence of decisions he'd made while believing no one would ever question him. Grant admitted something then he'd never said out loud before. Every award Nora ever received had made him feel invisible. Whenever customers asked to meet her, he heard in his own mind that his contribution meant nothing at all. Vivian had offered him an image where he could be the creator, the owner, and a man desired by a famous woman all at once. He explained that at first he'd only wanted to protect his place beside her, then to control the brand, and finally to prove he could succeed without Nora entirely. He never understood that trying to escape her shadow, he'd destroyed the only relationship where anyone had ever shared real credit with him. Nora listened without interrupting. She had waited months for this explanation, and now it sounded small next to the damage it had caused. "You were never in my shadow," she said. "I named you in every interview. I sat you right beside me. I called what I'd started before I ever met you ours. You're the one who turned my light into a threat because you only ever knew how to shine if someone else disappeared first." Grant apologized and asked if there was any chance they could rebuild even a friendship. Nora calmly refused. Forgiving him didn't mean letting him back into her life. She could release the hatred without ever opening that door again. She pulled the wedding ring, the one Dana had recovered the night of the anniversary, out of her bag and set it down on the table between them. It wasn't an invitation or a sentimental gesture. It was the return of a symbol whose meaning Grant had emptied out completely. He cried for the first time in front of her, but Nora didn't mistake tears for repair. She told him he owed apologies to the workers, the suppliers, and the customers he'd used along the way, and that no remorse would mean anything if it only existed to relieve his own guilt. When she walked out of the room, she didn't feel triumph. She felt space. Her marriage no longer required a daily response from her. It could finally become the past without continuing to manage her future. Vivian received a lighter sentence for her cooperation, along with fines, a temporary ban from managing companies, and an order to compensate Roots for the sabotage. Her lawyers tried negotiating an interview where she could frame her downfall as a comeback story, but no serious outlet wanted any part of it. For a while, she kept posting vague messages about betrayal and mistakes, carefully avoiding Nora's name. Eventually, she deleted her main accounts and left the city altogether. Nora heard through the press that she'd moved in with relatives but didn't look for further details. Vivian had entered her life like an enormous figure, wrapped in luxury and surrounded by cameras. In the end, she was reduced to a lesson Nora never needed to repeat. Not every woman pitted against another by the same man has to hate her forever, but understanding doesn't have to turn into closeness either. Vivian had chosen to humiliate, sabotage, and lie. Her downfall didn't erase those choices, and her punishment was no longer Nora's responsibility to carry. The old Delta Sol space sold months later to a hotel group. Before the facade came down, the new owners invited Nora back to collect any personal belongings. She returned with her team and found the apron Grant had thrown to the floor that night. Somebody had quietly kept it folded away in a linen box. The old sauce stain was still there, dark and dry. Marcus offered to clean it, but Nora decided to leave it exactly as it was. They hung the apron on a modest wall inside Roots, not as a trophy of her humiliation, but as a reminder of the moment one closed door forced open another. Below it, they mounted a small plaque. "Nobody can expel you from what you know how to create." Customers asked about the story sometimes, but Nora only told it when it served to honor her team. She never presented her success as something she'd built alone, knowing that without the people who crossed that street that night, her victory would have been nothing but an emotion with no structure behind it. Roots grew steadily over the following year without ever losing its human scale. Nora turned down every offer to franchise it into something bigger and faster, agreeing only to open one small second location run by Marcus. Dana became a full partner, responsible for operations, drafting clear contracts for every single employee. Wade built a network of local producers with guaranteed payments and fairly reviewed prices. The pastry chef opened his own bakery connected to the restaurant. Nora distributed ownership shares based on the money, the hours, and the risks everyone had taken on during the build. Some advisors warned her that splitting ownership would weaken her control. She told them total control had never been the goal. She wanted to make sure Roots never depended on one single signature or one single relationship ever again. Every major decision required more than one voice, and anyone could review the books at any time. Transparency didn't erase conflict entirely, but it made it impossible for anyone to hide betrayal behind the words, "Just trust me." The menu kept changing with the seasons. The most celebrated dishes were never copies of Delta Sol, but creations born after the expulsion itself. The charred okra dish became something of a symbol, though Nora refused to ever call it the revenge dish. She preferred explaining that it had been born in an unfinished kitchen on 2 borrowed burners made by a team that didn't even know yet whether they'd get to open. Alan Medina wrote in a later review that Roots didn't serve nostalgia, it served transformed memory. That line moved Nora deeply because it described exactly what she wanted to do with her own life too. She couldn't erase the betrayal or the public humiliation, but she could turn those experiences into clearer boundaries, fairer contracts, and a completely different kind of leadership. Healing never meant pretending nothing had happened. It meant refusing to let the pain keep making choices for her. Every service became a quiet answer to the night she'd been told she no longer belonged in her own kitchen. On Roots' first anniversary, the team held a dinner with no press invited at all. They welcomed Fontaine, the farmer's former customers, and the family members who had once painted walls or lent tools for free. Dana projected old photographs from the renovation, damp walls, stacked chairs, dust-covered hands, and the very first hand-painted sign. Marcus handed Nora a framed copy of the sheet of paper where the name Roots had first appeared. She tried to give a speech, but emotion closed her throat before she could get very far. She looked around the room and understood the real restaurant was never the dining room or even the kitchen. It was the quiet agreement to take care of one another, even with no guarantee of success. She raised her glass and thanked everyone who had crossed that street without ever asking how much they'd earned for it. Then she added that nobody should ever feel obligated to stay out of loyalty alone. The freedom to leave was exactly what made the choice to stay mean something at all. When dinner ended, Nora stepped outside. The old building across the street sat under construction, the Delta Sol name already gone. For a few minutes, she watched the last letters come down off the facade. She felt no sadness and no satisfaction. only the certainty of watching something that had finally stopped defining her. Inside Roots, the sound of her team's voices mixed with the clink of glasses. Wade stepped out to check if she was all right. She said she was, and smiled toward the lit window behind her. For a long time, she had believed Grant stole 6 years of her life from her. Now she understood she had also lived through real friendships, real lessons, and a talent that had remained completely intact the entire time. The betrayal could never turn her whole past into a lie. Some roots had grown even in the wrong soil. The difference now was that she finally knew which ones were worth keeping and which ones needed to be cut so the whole tree could keep on living. Before heading back inside, Nora caught her own reflection in the glass, still wearing her white chef's coat. It didn't carry her name stitched across it, just one small word over the heart. Team. She thought back to the night Grant threw her apron on the floor, trying to prove he could take her place away from her. He'd kept the keys, the contract, the lamps, and the brand for a while, but he'd lost the cooks, the servers, the suppliers, and the customers who trusted the truth behind every single plate. Nora hadn't gotten her dignity back because a judge decided to hand it to her. She had kept it the entire time by refusing to accept that any piece of paper could define her worth. She walked into Roots and closed the door against the cold outside. Not against the world. The kitchen stayed lit. The bread had just come out of the oven, and her team was waiting to share the very last table of the night. Nora's story leaves behind one simple truth. For anyone who confuses ownership with power, someone can take a facade, register a name, and change the locks, but they can never possess talent, memory, or loyalty. They never bothered to earn. Grant believed the restaurant belonged to him because his signature sat on the paperwork. Vivian believed years of skill could be replaced with a polished image. Both of them held on to the wrapping for a moment and lost everything that ever gave it meaning. Nora, on the other hand, walked out with no keys at all and found people willing to build something new right beside her. She didn't win because her enemies fell apart. She won because she stopped measuring her own life by everything they could take from her. And when the lights of Roots finally went dark that night, the last image wasn't a woman who'd gotten her revenge. It was a free woman, surrounded by the people who had chosen every single day to walk beside her.